What's poppin', family? Today we're gonna be doing a decode on Monsters Inc. So this movie was originally produced in 2001 and is still relevant to this day. The main character is James P. Sullivan, and James P. Sullivan, or Sully, is known as the top scarer in the world, and he does this willingly. He is fully engulfed in his purpose, and so scaring is his purpose. So he is the absolute best at it. He happens to work with his best friend, who is named Mike Wazowski. Mike is a cyclops, a one-eyed creature with two horns, okay? And these two horns represent the two pillars. Now, the singular vision is the one vision walking through those two pillars. This is what Mike represents. Mike is also the aide to Sully. Sully represents the soiled, the tarnished. So Sully essentially translates to sullied, and sullied translates to soiled. And this is where we get the idea of a tarnished or a spotted past. So Sully is representative of someone who is engulfed in their purpose but comes from a spotty past, therefore may overcompensate by being the best at what they are told to do, i.e., be the top scarer in the world. And this pleases his direct boss, who would happen to be Henry J. Waternoose. And Waternoose is interesting in itself because if you think about water and noose separately, water would essentially refer to a wave of sorts, where a noose would refer to the end of a rope or the knot at the end of a rope. And so if you think about a knot represents a struggle of sorts, frustration. If you've ever tried to untie a knot, depending on its complexity and how it is tied, it can be very unfrustrating to tie a knot, to the point to where you reach a moment and you have to decide whether or not just to cut the string and start entirely new, or actually figure out how to untie that string. And so if we are seeing Waternoose as essentially a wave of individuals who are at the end of their rope and they are in a knot, they are tightly tied by their idealistic views that they can continue to take from a source that is not sustainable. And so allow me to paint a broader picture for a second in regards to the actual universe in which Monsters Inc. resides. So when we look at Earth, okay, let's assume that Earth has reached a state where it is so polluted that animals are now having to mutate. We're seeing multiple animal mutations. And because of these animal mutations, nature is always going to adapt. And so let's say that nature adapts, and nature adapts so well that nature progresses past humans. At that point, animals would essentially overshadow the limited population of humans. And as a result, humans die out and animals become the dominant species. So thousands of years later, animals become what we see as and become to know as monsters in Monsters Inc., aka a super species. And these monsters essentially have an energy crisis without humans, because the problem is humans are the source of energy for all of their machines. So the monsters invent time traveling doors that allow them to harness energy from humans in the past. To prevent monsters from changing time, they are taught to believe humans are toxic and that they cannot interfere with that reality. So most monsters are kept on a need-to-know basis and told only to do one thing, and that is to extract screams. I almost said streams, which is funny, because if you know anything about Freudian slips, typically they say, or operating under the assumption of that theory, anything that a person says and they say, oh, I misspoke, it's actually what they meant to say. And so it's kind of a way that the brain is choosing similar words that could have similar meanings or similar connotations, but when you apply them to a wider context, it starts to make a whole lot of sense in many different areas. So, hopping back to our timeline, okay, we've got monsters. They invented the time traveling doors, and the monsters are kept on a need-to-know basis. They're told not to interfere. They're told humans are toxic to their health. Hey, you'll die if one touches you, okay? This is what they're told and taught. So they are taught this on an institutional level. Everybody in society believes this. Their society is set up in a way that supports this ideology. And so only a few monsters at the top know that this is actually time travel. And so Sully, or the Soiled, becomes attached to a human child, and the human child name is Mary. So Mary is this archetype of innocence, purity, i.e. the Virgin Mary. And so the Soiled becomes attached to the pure. This is like opposites attract, yin and yang. And so both essentially begin to overcome their fears and love one another, because Boo, or Mary, initially has a fear of monsters because Randall is her monster. And this is shown a few times with Boo's drawings. And so Boo is drawing these monsters, and again, in her reality, this can appear just like childish drawings, but this is a real monster that is actually tormenting her through a time traveling portal. And again, how can a child articulate this? So this is why it's important from a monster's point of view to prey upon a child, because a child does not have the necessary emotional capacity to even convey the conditions upon which it is enduring or it is placed within. It is not only until a later time, a later point, where those memories are refleshed, they are rehashed, and they reemerge just like a cork that has been held underwater, submerged for some time. It manages to pop up at a later date. And at that later date, the person, the individual, can then look and see from a different perspective what truly or may have not occurred, because as we know, memories can be very unreliable. They change over time, and this is because memories at the core are a string of stories that are assembled and bundled into a universal story that is cohesive to a character. Without memories, how can a character exist? When you exist within somebody else's mind through a shared memory, this is revalidating your character in the universal conscious net or grid. And when a belief is reaffirmed in this universal conscious grid, it is a general consensus, it is a general understanding what it is and what it has become. So once it reaches that point, then it is understood, it is common practice, it is a household name per se. It is something that becomes synonymous with an action such as Google. Google is synonymous with searching, and this is because of its actual practical use case. And there are many other search engines, however, again, they even may get mislabeled as Googling, searching, because the two are synonymous. The two have melded together, they have meshed together. And this is through the association and through the updating of a mind, collective mind map, a hive mind, essentially. And so now we have the attachment to the soiled and the pure, the child, right? But the child, Sully knows that the child cannot live within this reality of monsters. So he does everything in his power to return her to her universe. But upon doing so, he happens to discover, or rather uncover, a huge conspiracy plot to kidnap children and forcibly remove the screams from them. And this is something that we see the CEO of Monsters Inc., the top head guy, Henry J. Waternoose, complicit in, along with Randall and a few other monsters. So their plan for remedying the energy crisis, because humans, or rather human children, were harder to scare, was to forcibly remove the screams by using a machine. And so this machine can be seen as, again, a symbol of extracting the life force. Because if you think about a scream is something primal. A scream is a release of energy. And when you look at ancient cultures, anytime you look at war cries, these things are all deeply spiritual in nature because they tap into a primal power. When you access that primal power of screaming, think about how society has essentially updated the collective conscious grid to where people don't even have ringtones anymore. Everybody's phone is on silent. Everything is on silent. Everything is about noise pollution, noise control. Let's control the noise. Let's create noise ordinances. Let's create these fake laws, these things that only exist when someone is there to enforce them, someone who is an agent of the collective conscious grid that opposes noise. And so even when we ask ourselves, what is noise truly? Because there is many definitions. However, I would say noise is something unpleasant, something you don't want to hear. Now, if you are living a certain way, obviously the contrary or the contradiction to that way of life, you're not going to want to hear that, because that would directly challenge everything you hold to be true, everything you know to be true about your existence, your character, your purpose, your meaning of life. When you fundamentally have to reorder, reassemble, restructure these things, it can become a daunting task that most simply give up on. And because they give up on that, they operate off of default settings. They don't go into understanding the benefits of overclocking a CPU. The benefits, while there is also drawbacks, there is certain benefits to enhancing the efficiency of your vessel naturally through understanding essentially neuro-linguistic programming, understanding that the subconscious is programmed via 3 methods: repetition, trauma, and symbols. Think about how many things. See, that's why we silence the ringtones. Universe playing the test. So we're gonna keep it moving. Sully becomes attached. Sully returns Boo, discovers the forcible plot to kidnap the children, and Water Noose and his associates are removed by the CDA. The CDA is interesting because this is the agency that is called anytime there is any presence of a child detection agency. And so they come in and they contain the area. They wear hazmat suits, and they essentially dispose of any type of contraband or anything that comes from the reality of the child. And once they do so, it's important to realize and to highlight on the fact that they place a cone of silence. And they place a cone of silence around anybody who has interacted with the child. This is interesting because if you go back and look at the symbolic meaning of the dunce cap, this was originally a good thing, seen as something worn by wizards, scholars, and this was believed to funnel the information down onto the head or the brain of the wearer. So from the tip of the hat all the way down to the cone or to the bottom circular portion. And if you look at the cones placed upon the monsters, all the cones are going the opposite way. They're coming up this way. And so this is almost reverse. And I was just thinking about this. If the concept is a pointed hat brings the information down, well, if we reverse that, would that not bring the information out? So essentially, it's kind of reversing the effects, and by doing so, it's almost inducing a form of subconscious memory loss, because it's just like, let's release this. And because of that, it's interesting when you see the CDA's involvement anytime that there is a child detected. That's the first people they call. But the CDA is also the ones who take away Henry J. Waternoose. So this kind of begs to question who is essentially running the CDA and issuing these orders, because how or when did their policies change, and essentially where does the CDA fall under the hierarchy? Because if they have the ability to shut down the factory, to shut down Monsters Inc. anytime that there is an accident, that would, to me, indicate some form of dominance, over the factory Monsters Inc. as a company, despite it being the sole energy producer for the town, the city. So I'm very curious to dig in more to see if there's even more information on the Child Detection Agency, but this is one thing that I noticed and found to be quite interesting. So Sully is now put in charge of what becomes a laugh factory. And so instead of harnessing the power of screams, the monsters then take the laughs of children and convert their machines to run off of laughter. And this is a fundamental difference, because when you're running off of laughter instead of fear, this is almost a sense of willing versus force. And this is kind of a fundamental war of nature. Is kind of will versus force. It's kind of like thermodynamics when it comes to heat versus cold. Heat operates completely differently than the way cold operates. When particles are cold and when particles are heated, they operate differently. And it's important to understand, for instance, green, it would be seen or a part of the beneficial light on the color spectrum or the light spectrum. Whereas purple, or rather ultraviolet, which would be also considered non-visible light, which is also coincidentally the color of Randall, who is purple, and can also become non-visible. And this is harmful light, essentially, right? We don't want too much of this light. So essentially this is saying we don't want too much of this energy. And the blue and the violet is kind of the crossover point. And then after that comes the green and the yellow and the red and so on. So pretty much from green to red, yellowish, that would be considered the beneficial light, whereas the blue and the violet in the middle would kind of be it's kind of like the island, it's kind of like the outlier. It is see, blue light carries more energy than red light. So typically, blue beings are going to be associated with being highly empathetic, advanced beings, and this is just simply because the color blue carries more energy than red. And typically you see a lot of red, even if you look at society as a whole. Fast food, any type of restaurant, food, snack, all typically these colors are going to be red, yellow, orange, and these associations are to your lower chakras, your lower light centers. And when you are attracted to these things, the yellow lights, the yellow arches, the symbol, and the lights, this is again the repetition of seeing the symbol every time you pass by the lights. This is programming into your subconscious that craving for a certain light, not so much the food, but the light, because it's like we are attracted to these different lights. Everything is light. So you can't get lost in the light because everything is light. So these types of lures are essentially triggers to our subconscious to recall and to feed these lower energy centers, these lower primal centers that keep us from operating out of the higher energetic centers, such as the heart chakra or the Christ consciousness, and above crown chakra, throat chakra, speaking truth. All these things are important, but they need to fundamentally be set up prior to being turned on, because it's just like if your wiring is not sufficient to handle 250 amps, you only got 15 amp rated wire, right? If that circuit goes live, if that circuit goes active, you're going to completely fry that system. That is too much energy for that system. That system is not built for that. That system requires 15 amps because that's what it's rated for. You know, maybe even a less because of efficiency and energy loss due to heat. Everything when it comes down to energy loss is due to heat. Heat is the ultimate destructor when it comes to computing, when it comes to any type of computational anything that functions, any device that generates a field of electricity, it is subject to thermodynamics. And again, when we talked about things operating differently dependent upon the state that they are in, things operate differently. People operate differently when they are hot versus when they are cold, especially when we put these at the extremes. Put somebody in a desert with no water, extreme heat, versus somebody in Antarctica with no shelter and no warmth. And again, you're going to have two fundamentally, drastically different approaches to survival at that point. But at the core is, again, still the idea of, and that is what strings everything together, the concept of survival. This is, again, an idea that was implemented and put in as a failsafe into the system. But what is the ultimate purpose of this failsafe? What is the purpose of surviving in a system that is built upon creating situations of suffrage by design? Because again, this is about extracting the fear, because fear gets things done. When we are able to utilize fear, we are able to get things done in a prompt manner. Sure, we could get things done without fear, but fear gets things done quickly. So if we are on somebody's timetable, then of course there's going to be objective markers, and there's going to be a reference point on, okay, this is where civilization is. We need to take it here. Versus if nobody is planning at that top global strategic level, then the universe is just truly doing what we're doing, and everybody is just responding. Everybody is just playing offense. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that there is a group of individuals, maybe a coalition, I'm not sure, but there has to be a form of global strategizing going on. And this is because somebody has to be thinking at that global level. If it has crossed my mind, it has crossed somebody else's mind. And so when you understand that these are things being broadcasted, the better you are at receiving and translating, the better of a channel you become. However, as we translate into this new digital age where essentially anybody can receive images in their mind via virtual reality, this is an entirely different thing. It's interesting that the monsters still had a form of simulation. They still had a form of virtual reality. And this shows essentially the it shows essentially the importance of the technology and the longevity of the technology, because it still holds utility to simulate things. And when you understand the benefit of simulation, this is when you can begin to think on that global strategist level, because simulation is beneficial. However, we have to have data in order to derive our simulations from first. Without the data, we can't extrapolate upon anything. We can't make any type of calculations. Okay, we need input in order to produce output. And so, jumping back to the timeline, right? Boo becomes obsessed with finding Sully. And essentially, she knows that doors are the key. And so she develops a way to travel time using doors. And this leads to the progression and the larger part of the Pixar theory, which is that all of the films Disney produces are tied together. And you can research the Pixar theory and essentially search and find out all the different movies and how they're connected. I might do a breakdown on how the different movies are connected, but I felt that it was important to mention essentially the progression of Boo, because that was always something that I was curious about after I watched the movie. Is like, even going through something like that as a child, that has to create a lasting memory upon the subconscious, upon the psyche. You know, seeing these monsters, seeing this technology, Boo being exposed to all this advanced technology that they have created essentially within their universe, within their monster universe. And I was thinking, there's no way that she didn't grow up to essentially try to emulate that and find Sully. And so imagine a person dead set on finding the person who saved them, you know, because Sully was the person who saved her from Randall, who Randall actually represents or translates to Wolf's Shield, which the first thing I thought of was dogma, or essentially dogmatic. And if that essentially, that energy, that archetype represents a harmful, non-visible light. This is harmful, non-visible information, because light is information. So this is what Randall represents. That belief system, right? Randall essentially represents the force. and Sully represents the will. Sully was the top scarer in the world willingly, while Randall, the antagonist, was trying to do everything he could to get Sully's spot, but Sully just made it look effortless. And this is where a lot of Randall's frustration essentially stemmed from. But we see, Randall essentially was part of the driving force for Waternoose, who also believed in the idea of force. And when we talk about the fundamental laws of nature, again, this is important to understand force versus will, because when you understand human nature and fear, laughter, you're going to typically associate fear with force, and you're going to associate laughter with willing. Yeah, pretty much everybody is willing to laugh. I don't know anybody who isn't willing to laugh. It's simply about a understanding, right, of these archetypes and essentially how the energy plays out, because they are just avatars for the energy. And especially as we transgress into this next digital age where everybody is going to have an avatar and can be anybody they truly want to be with ease, this is going to create a new skill, a new level of discernment for identifying people who are not authentic, who are not themselves, who are just copies, who are just clones. And these clones are evident because they are operating off of shared beliefs. And these shared beliefs can be destructive towards a certain group or just the opposite ideology, because it is similar to a knot. It is a tight structure that is so tight and so constricting, it can not allow anything to flow through. And because there is no flow, there is stagnation. Anything that is stagnant, stagnant pools of water is what mosquitoes are developed in. So any bodies of water that is not continuously being restored essentially breeds this form of blood-sucking parasitic energies that feed off of another host. And this is the entire concept of Monsters, Inc., is that these monsters are feeding off of the energy of humans. And so Boo becoming, or Mary rather, becoming obsessed with finding her savior, essentially, figures out, a way to travel time and essentially becomes a witch traveling across time to find Sully, not realizing that he was 1,000 years ahead. So she's going back in time, searching for all these clues, searching for anything, and not realizing that he was ahead of time. And so Boo, according to the Pixar theory, would then become the witch from Brave. And there's a few different pieces of evidence to support this theory, but I like the concept of a person experiencing something so life-changing as a child that their purpose becomes intertwined with resolving the knot that was created in their heart at that moment, restoring the flow and truly trying to even understand the meshing of two worlds. The world she knew as her reality without monsters, and then the new reality where there was nothing but monsters and monsters were dominant. And this is almost seen as two extremes, two sides of the spectrum that one must operate within, acknowledging that this world is full of monsters, but also acknowledging the innocence and the ability, the potential for people to do good when the environment exists for them to do so. If the environment is not conducive to a person doing good, if the environment punishes good acts and rewards, acts of injustice, then this is where we get the confusion from. This is where we get the loss of translation when it comes to purpose and people understanding what their purpose is. Being a protector is the ultimate form of distraction, and this is important to highlight upon, because being a protector, right, it is essentially an easy way to have a fulfilled sense of duty on a renewed basis, on a short-term daily basis, because as the role of a protector, day by day, so long as the thing that you are protecting remains protected, your purpose is fulfilled. And so this is essentially what I would call, low-hanging fruit. It's not something that is kind of like just doing the bare minimum. It's nothing extraordinary. It's just you're doing what you're supposed to, and that's it. And then you have the overachievers, the ones who are determined on doing things differently, the Neo, the chosen one, the one who is the anomaly, the variant, the Loki energy that comes in and adds a bit of chaos to a system, adds a bit of entropy to a system. And entropy is the ultimate way, or rather chaos is the ultimate way to fully test a system's functionality. So if you want to see how capable a system is, introduce a level of chaos. Once a level of chaos is introduced into the system, then you can determine how well the developer prepared for that level or method of resistance. If the developer does not code or validate a user's input, then let's say the user inputs something that the program was not expecting, and this crashes the program. This is a bad thing, obviously. So as a developer, you want to ensure that you're validating user input and receiving proper input so that the program can continue to run smoothly. When we look at Monsters, Inc., this is an allegory, a representation of culture, of society, and it's still relevant to this day, because the past is not a place, but rather a mentality. And when you understand that there are many people stuck in the past, and these monsters feed off of humans in the past, so they understand that humans in the past are powerless and oblivious. And because of that, they are able to feed off of them. They're able to harness their children's energy and create an entire civilization ran and based off of human children energy. And for the most part, the humans are unaware and assume nothing is amiss, nothing is wrong. However, again, upon closer inspection, the drawings, but again, as a child, you can't convey these things in an elaborate way. But it is ingrained into your psyche. And so it is a part of who you will become. Either you will become that monster yourself, or you will seek to protect and fight for your innocence as the example set before you by your savior, or the sullied, the person, the energy with the soiled, the past, the tarnished past, with the unclean past, who sacrificed himself for the purity. This should sound familiar to a few different mythological storylines. And this is all, again, history repeating itself. This is just a cycle of life, information being regurgitated and presented in a new way, but it's the same information. Monsters rule the world through fear, and they are allowed to do so because the humans unknowingly are unwilling to acknowledge the existence of these monsters. And so because of that, because of their ignorance, this continues to happen behind the scenes, in the dark, in the middle of the nights, and their children are affected. And this has long-term repercussions on an entire civilization that they cannot even begin to predict, which essentially can lead to the human population being wiped out and animals essentially becoming the dominant species, as I laid out previously in the video. So, this is Monsters Inc. Destruct, Decode. Peace.